Spencer Maughn, Managing Partner from Finistere Ventures. Welcome to the evokeAG studio. From your presentation and your involvement with the conference, what is the one thing you'd like delegates to take away?
Yeah, I think that the one thing I would want delegates to take away from our perspective at Finistere is that the opportunity in ag and food tech is very, very large, and it's accelerating in terms of the pace of innovation underwriting that opportunity.
Right, now you come from a unique perspective on that though, don't you? Because you're not just an investor, you're involved in the investment sphere, but you're a geneticist as well. So is that a helpful overlap?
Yes, I'd say from our firm's perspective also, not to overly plug us, but we have focused on real technology. So when we invest in a company, we look for defensible intellectual property, which usually means a patent and that sort of thing. And we're pretty focused on deep tech. So a lot of what we've done in the past is really life science centered. So yeah, my background from being a plant geneticist for a very long time is helpful in terms of at least understanding what is feasible and what isn't from a time point of view, because a large part of it is not just having a good idea, but it's also timing things and understanding how that time horizon in developing the company fits with a venture capital sort of outlook.
There's a lot of, there's some jargon in there in terms of terminology, and the one I'd like to ask you about actually, your presentation notes, one of the things you're involved with said, are we at the tipping point of moving from point solutions to platform solutions in the agri-tech food sector? For the uninitiated, what does that even mean?
Yeah, so I appreciate that question. Because it is probably the other point that I would want people to take away, at least from interacting with myself or my partner, Arama Kukatai. Point solutions, in our view, was what has characterised, at least in the United States, the first wave of AgTech, starting, say, 2010, which was directing a lot of de-risked technologies, whether that was data science, data imaging, IoT and sensors, and solving a singular problem with a best-in-class solution that was scalable for production agriculture. And that we called a point solution. It was a single point of value, and it was a solution to it, and best in class, and could scale on providing that service or product. Now, we believe at this point, sort of 7 to 9 years later in that first cycle, we're starting to see companies that were point solution companies get a footprint, so attached to enough acres in the US, where you've morphed into a platform. So it's sort of like, when you had DOS first come out, there was a small number of machines and some mainframes and things like that ran it. But you get to a tipping point of users where all of a sudden you can put a huge number of other products on top of that. And you've become all of a sudden a brand new, very large incumbent within the value chain. And that's that switch to sort of platform companies. And so we believe that, over the next probably say 3 to 5 years, there will be new platform companies. Now, they may be standalone companies, or they might be acquired by current incumbents and just be a whole new platform within those.
You talked about tipping point there, and you've been quoted as saying just because an industry hasn't been disrupted doesn't mean that it won't be disrupted. I'm kind of getting the sense from what you're talking about, that's what you're right in the midst of now.
Yes.
Or you and agriculture and agri-food in general.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, in my talk, I sort of give an example that's close to me from US retail, and talking about, the original everything stores, Montgomery Ward's and Sears Roebuck, that had really created one technology, a point solution, if you will, around catalogues, mail order catalogues, and they dominated US retail. And they did so for over 100 years. And Sears filed for bankruptcy, and Montgomery Ward's died in 2000. So while they for a very long time they were the channel to consumers, that wasn't just going to always be the status quo. And that can come about from a change in consumer preference or end user preference and what they're really looking for, and just not understanding the market, or it can come from also a brand new technology, right, that just absolutely obliterates what they're doing, which is what Kodak saw, right, the shift to digital. And I think we've sort of got both in ag and food.
Well, you've got side players as well that are facilitating that, though, aren't they, in terms of data storage solutions, Amazon, whoever, the cloud-based solutions, who are now players as well, facilitating this rapid transformation.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. I mean, from where we sit in Silicon Valley, you've got, the first wave of companies, Hewlett-Packards and IBMs and even Microsoft I'd sort of put in there. And then you had these sort of cloud-based and internet-based ones, the Googles and, this sort of thing, ending up with now social media companies, right, as a real conduit to channel. And a number of these companies have announced an AgTech and food tech strategy. Google did last year. IBM already has said that that's one of the areas that they want to develop. So there is a shift in space just in terms of who is viewing themselves as a potential ag tech company, right? And that's pretty interesting from the point of view of venture capital and technology companies, because if these, traditional Silicon Valley tech companies get involved, that could change things much more rapidly than if we relied on traditional CPG and big ag companies.
Transformation's an interesting point. Last year you penned a paper that said agriculture is set to be a $100 billion industry in Australia by 2030, but you said it's struggling because it hasn't got targeted investment. Yeah. What do you reckon needs to be done? So,
around that $100 billion pull quote, which wasn't mine, that idea came from the government, is a target. I have lots of comments. First off, but before I talk about, the capital and impediments to it, I'd say that reframing it, because it's always talked about in Australia from a production point of view, can we export more to China? If I want to be really overly simplistic, which is fine to grow production, but it would be really nice, I think, if we could actually include export of technology as part of the driver of that 100 billion, especially when we look at net margins on farm of being less than 10% and net margins of technologies companies being sort of 30%. That's far more attractive just from a standard of living point of view. So I want to make that point, but coming to yours, I think some of the impediments, and it's speculative, so there's other points of view too, but one is capital that's connected, both connected to market understanding in ag and food globally, because Australia only represents less than 2%. So if you can understand this market but not understand the US market, for instance, and connected capital to other VCs, because ultimately these days companies, while it is in a way cheaper than ever to start a company, to grow them into globally dominant companies in a globalized economy takes a significant amount of capital, and you need to syndicate those with groups of investors. And so having access to, say, the west coast of the US, which is by far the dominant force in venture capital, is important. And I don't think that those bridges really exist. And I think that that's a deficit. I'll leave it there.
Well, Australia does struggle. I think I was reading a similar report. We venture capital investment here is something like 1/17 of what Israel is. Yeah.
No, it's tiny. It's very, very small. I mean, in my talk, just referring to the study that we did with the University of Sydney at the United States Study Centre, where we tried to characterise, albeit it's not comprehensive because it's hard to get a lot of data around private companies, but I think is directionally accurate. We tried to characterise the AgTech investing landscape here, and the US per capita, it's at about $5.80. And Australia's 12 cents. So, when you look at both the nominal dollar value of it, as well as the percentage of GDP, it is massively underfunded globally. And then when you take that sort of scale between Australia and the US on a normalised basis, it's outrageously underinvested here.
You made some policy recommendations out of that, or 3 areas. Briefly, what are those, or what do you think is most important we need to change in this country to turn the boat, for want of a better description?
Yes. So obviously, I have my view. It's probably more a personal view, but I think that a couple of things are missing from the climate here for venture investing. We've already touched on one, and that's connections, I think. And I think we talked about ways of attracting US firms to Australia in that report. I think that you can target them in a scheme where you can make it very attractive, whether that's through non-dilutive financing or even from commercialisation grants to help set up some of those firms here. Because the net benefits you get from attracting that capital is huge, because every deal that an Australian invests in will probably have the leverage then of 3 times that amount of capital from overseas. And so the amount of foreign direct investment that ultimately will come is something that will far outweigh that upfront expense to try to attract those firms to be active here. And what's interesting is that my last 2 firms that were generalist firms in Silicon Valley, they deployed less than $10 billion in the history of them since 1969 of those firms. The enterprise value aggregated across their portfolios that their money went in the first round of financing to support all those companies is greater than Australian GDP. So the power of small amounts of capital, as long as it's the right capital, is really, really significant. And so I think attracting that US, capital here in a substantive way is important to work alongside the Australians. And then the other recommendation that I'm pretty passionate about in there is that Australia has a pretty big focus on multinationals from the point of view of access to technology, but not development of technology. So when we look at the multinationals in Australia, they're all sales and marketing engines. They actually don't have a lot of product development, from sort of A to Z, right? Making the whole product here in Australia, like a Google Maps, right, from Sydney or something. That doesn't happen much. And I think attracting multinationals to actually make bricks and mortar, critical mass-sized R&D centres that are developing products, like the car industry had, in Victoria, which has now been exploited in other ways by Bosch, for instance, creates then not just a level of significance that goes beyond, to the parent company that is, beyond just, that's a small market that we get some revenue from, but wow, they're making a critical next product for us that we will release globally. So you get much better connection to the decision makers in those companies that are moving the needle globally around these markets. But also better market intelligence, because you're at the cutting edge all of a sudden, of what's being developed. And so young people that have technical degrees that join those companies then understand where the market is at, and they know what's state of the art, and they can come out of those companies and build relevant technology companies. So I think that's a really critical piece that also Bill Farris has talked a lot about and spoke of in the AFR.
I could keep on going for quite a way. There's one last question I will ask, though. One final question.
Yes.
One final brief question. You've been out of Australia for quite some time. You obviously come backwards and forwards. Do you see anything happening? Is now an important time? Do you see changes occurring that can foster a lot of what you were talking about?
So I haven't seen a lot of changes. I think that there's a much greater awareness of entrepreneurship in Australia. So I went out of Australia in the early 2000s to the UK first, and at that time there was very little entrepreneurial activity from a startup VC point of view, and there was probably 2 or 3 VC firms that had some sort of presence. I think that there is more capital. I think it's still dominated by family offices rather than institutional investors, which is a bit different, just dynamically. And while there's many, many more startups, and you can just look at the number of companies that are created, in terms of kicked off here, as well as incubators and so on, I don't think there's been much of a change from an R&D point of view, as I pointed out, real market access, or for that matter, connected capital. So I think, those things have been talked about for quite a while, actually. I'd say even going back to when I was leaving, and very little has changed. And I think it's hard to see the step change that will come in a faster time period than something organic, right, without really addressing those deficits.
Stephen Maughn, thank you very much for joining us in the evokeAG studio.
Thank you very much, Drew. Appreciate it. Thanks.